There is a moment before sunrise in the Black Hills of South Dakota when the world has not yet decided what it is. The sky above the ridgelines holds a deep and particular shade of darkness, not quite black, not yet blue, somewhere between the two, the way ancient rock holds color before the light touches it. The ponderosa pines stand perfectly still. The grass along the valley floors has no movement in it. The streams that thread through the lower meadows carry only the faintest sound, the quietest possible suggestion of water moving through stone. If you were standing on one of the higher ridges at this hour, looking out across the rolling silhouette of the hills, you might have the impression that nothing has changed here in a very long time, that the landscape before you is solid, enduring, permanent. The hills rise and fall in long, quiet rhythms. The stone outcrops along the upper slopes emerge from the forest like the shoulders of something immense that has been sleeping for longer than any human history can measure. The air is cold, and it carries the faint resinous scent of pine, but there is something the surface does not reveal. Beneath those hills, beneath the limestone and the ancient rock, beneath the roots of the pine trees and the cold surface of the soil, there is another landscape entirely. It is not dramatic in the way that the word dramatic is usually meant. It has no sky. It has no horizon. It has no wind. It is a world of stone passages and chambers, of mineral formations built over thousands of years by processes so gradual they can barely be imagined from within a human lifetime. It is dark in a way that most people have never experienced, a darkness so complete that a hand held before the face is invisible. And it is quiet in a way that is almost its own kind of sound, the sound of total stillness pressing gently against the ears. The Black Hills of South Dakota have a hidden world beneath them, and that world has been forming, slowly and patiently, for a span of time that reaches back far beyond any human presence on this land. This is the story of that underground world. It is a story that moves between the surface and the depths, between geological time and human memory, between scientific discovery and cultural meaning. It is a story that begins, as all stories of landscape must begin, with the ground itself. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through the hidden history and landscapes of America, you are welcome to subscribe. Share this documentary with someone who loves these slow explorations and settle in for the full journey tonight. There is a great deal to discover beneath these hills. The Black Hills of South Dakota are not, by any ordinary definition, mountains. They do not reach the heights of the Rockies to the west or the ranges of the Sierra Nevada further still. They do not have the dramatic vertical presence of the peaks that define the imagination of the American West. But they are something else entirely, something quieter and, in certain ways, more interesting to the geologist and the historian alike. They are an island in the geologic sense. They rise from the surrounding Great Plains as an isolated mass of ancient rock, lifting gently above the shortgrass prairie of western South Dakota and extending slightly into northeastern Wyoming. The hills cover an area of roughly 60 miles from north to south, and perhaps half that distance from east to west, forming an elliptical dome of elevated terrain that is visible from a great distance in every direction. From the plains below, they appear as a dark mass on the horizon, and it is this quality, the deep dark green of the dense ponderosa pine forests covering the upper elevations, that gave them the name by which they are known. The Lakota people knew these hills as Paha Sapa, which translates most directly as Black Hills, or sometimes as hills that are black, a name earned precisely because of the way the forest-covered slopes appear from across the open grassland. The elevation within the hills varies considerably. The highest point, Harney Peak, known today as Black Elk Peak, reaches just over 7,200 feet above sea level. Much of the interior of the hills sits at elevations between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. This elevation is enough to create a distinct environment, different in almost every measurable way from the surrounding plains. The hills receive more rainfall. They support forests of ponderosa pine, white spruce, and birch, with meadows and streams threading through the valleys between ridges. The streams that flow outward from the hills eventually join the larger river systems of the Great Plains, carrying water that has fallen on elevated ground down into lower country. The wildlife of the Black Hills reflects this ecological transition. Elk and deer move through the forested hillsides. Prairie falcons and eagles circle the open ridgelines. Coyotes travel the valley floors in the early morning hours. In the southern part of the hills, where the terrain opens onto rolling grassland, bison once moved in numbers that are difficult now to fully imagine. The hills have always been a place where different environments meet, where the forest world of higher elevation intersects with the grassland world of the surrounding plains. But it is the geology of the Black Hills that sets the foundation for everything else. The hills are, in geological terms, an eroded dome, a place where ancient rock has been pushed upward by deep forces in the earth, and then shaped over immense periods of time by erosion, by water, by ice, and by the slow, patient work of weathering. At the very center of the dome, the exposed rock is among the oldest on the continent, Precambrian metamorphic and igneous rock, some of which has been dated to more than 2 billion years in age. These ancient rocks form the core of the hills, the granite and schist that underlie the higher peaks. Moving outward from this ancient core, progressively younger layers of sedimentary rock surround the older formations in a series of concentric bands. Among these outer rings of sedimentary rock is a particularly important layer of limestone, a rock type that holds within its chemistry and its structure the conditions necessary for something extraordinary to occur underground. Limestone is a soluble rock. When slightly acidic water, rainwater, that has absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from soil moves through the fractures and pores of limestone over long periods of time, it can dissolve the rock itself. It can open fractures into passages. It can enlarge those passages into corridors. It can hollow out chambers. It can create, over thousands and millions of years, a hidden world of empty space within solid rock. In the southern and western portions of the Black Hills, this limestone forms the foundation of a landscape that appears, on the surface, to be a region of gentle hills and open meadows. But below the surface, that limestone tells a different story. It is riddled with passages. It has been shaped from within by water that no longer flows in the same ways it once did. And somewhere within that stone, concealed entirely from the surface, is one of the most complex cave systems in North America. The seasons in the Black Hills mark time in ways that feel very ancient. Winter brings deep snow to the higher elevations, filling the north-facing gullies and settling heavily in the pine branches. The wind in winter can be sharp and direct, coming off the open plains without obstacle. In spring, the snowmelt runs down through the valleys in small clear streams. Summer brings warm days and the rich smell of pine in the afternoon heat, with thunderstorms building over the higher ridges in the late afternoon. Autumn turns the birches and aspens to yellow along the stream banks, while the pines remain their steady dark green. And through all of these seasons, the landscape changes at the surface, while the world beneath it continues at an entirely different pace. This contrast between the seasonal, biological, human-scaled world of the surface and the geological, mineral, ancient world of the underground is one of the quieter themes that runs through any serious consideration of the Black Hills and what lies beneath them. There is a particular quality to this landscape that is worth noting before moving deeper into the story. The Black Hills do not announce themselves dramatically. They do not rise to sudden dramatic peaks that dominate the skyline with the force of, say, the Tetons or the peaks of Colorado. Instead, they emerge gradually, settling into the consciousness the way the best landscapes do through accumulation. A ridge here, a valley there, a long meadow between pines, a stream crossing, a rock face appearing suddenly above the tree line. The hills reveal themselves slowly, and perhaps because of this, they carry a quality of containment, of privacy, that larger, more dramatic mountain ranges do not always possess. This quality of containment has something to do, perhaps, with the scale of the hills relative to the plains surrounding them. Standing in the middle of the Black Hills, surrounded by pine forest, it is easy to feel enclosed in a particular world, separate from the open horizon of the grassland only a few miles distant. And if that sense of enclosure is true on the surface, consider what it might suggest about the landscape beneath the surface, where the enclosure is not merely a feeling, but a physical reality of stone walls in every direction. The cave, when we begin to approach it, is not simply a hole in the ground. It is the hidden interior of the same geological structure that creates the hills themselves. Surface and underground are not separate things. They are different expressions of the same stone. Any honest exploration of the Black Hills must begin not with the geologists, not with the cave explorers, not with the national park system, but with the people who have known this landscape for the longest time. Human presence in and around the Black Hills stretches back much further than the familiar historical narrative of American settlement might suggest. Archaeological evidence indicates that people were present in this region many thousands of years before the period of recorded European contact. The Great Plains were not an empty space awaiting discovery. They were a human landscape shaped by the movements and activities of people across an enormous span of time. The precise record of the oldest human presence in the Black Hills region remains incomplete, as it does for most of North America's deeper prehistory. Archaeological research has continued to expand our understanding of Paleo-Indian presence on the Great Plains, and the evidence suggests that people were present in this part of North America at least 12,000 years ago, possibly earlier. They were people adapted to an environment that was, in many respects, quite different from what we see today. The climate was cooler, the vegetation patterns were different. Animals that have long since vanished, mammoths, ancient bison much larger than the modern species, camels and horses that were native to the continent, moved across a landscape that would be recognizable in its broad outlines but foreign in its details. Over the thousands of years that followed, different peoples and different cultural traditions left evidence of their presence in and around the Black Hills. The archaeological record is not complete, and there are long periods for which the evidence is thin or subject to ongoing scholarly interpretation. What is clear is that this region was not peripheral. It was, over many periods, a central and significant landscape within broader networks of human movement and activity across the interior of the continent. In the period most directly relevant to the recent historical record, the Lakota people, also known as the Teton Sioux, came to consider the Black Hills as central to their world in ways that were both practical and deeply cultural. The historical process by which the Lakota came to inhabit the Black Hills region in the 18th and 19th centuries is itself a complex subject, involving movement, alliance, conflict, and adaptation that historians and scholars have studied in considerable depth. What is well established is that by the 19th century, the Lakota relationship with the Black Hills had become profound, intimate, and inseparable from Lakota cultural identity. The Lakota name for the Black Hills, Paha Sapa, reflects the appearance of the hills from the surrounding plains, the dark forest-covered mass rising above the lighter grassland. But the significance of the Black Hills to the Lakota went far beyond their visual appearance or their practical resources, though those resources, including timber, game, water, and shelter from winter storms, were genuinely important. The Black Hills occupied a place in Lakota understanding of the world that was cultural, historical, and spiritual in ways that outsiders have often struggled to fully appreciate. It is important to be precise here and to be honest about the limits of what can be said without misrepresenting the depth and complexity of Lakota tradition. The Lakota relationship with the Black Hills, including the traditions connected to specific places within and around those hills, belongs to the Lakota people themselves. It is not the place of a documentary like this one to summarize or condense that relationship into a simplified version that fits the expectations of outside audiences. What can be said, and said with confidence, is that the Black Hills were not merely scenery for the Lakota. They were part of a living cultural geography in which specific places carried specific meanings, and in which the landscape as a whole was understood as something more than a physical environment. Some Lakota traditions speak of the Black Hills as a place of origin, a place connected to the deepest understanding of who the Lakota people are and where they come from. Scholars who have worked with Lakota communities and studied Lakota oral tradition have noted the significance of these connections, while also acknowledging that the full content and meaning of specific traditions are not always appropriate to share publicly. This documentary respects that boundary. The point here is not to present a simplified version of Lakota tradition as though it were an exotic legend, but to acknowledge that the landscape of the Black Hills carries layers of human meaning that are inseparable from the geological story being told. The Black Hills in the 19th century were also the subject of a series of legal and political events that stand among the most significant and most painful in American history. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and then the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 recognized Lakota rights to extensive territories, including the Black Hills. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874, during an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, set in motion a process through which the United States government eventually took control of the Black Hills over the objection of the Lakota people. The legal and human consequences of that history have continued to the present day. The United States Supreme Court in 1980 ruled that the Black Hills had been taken from the Lakota people unlawfully and awarded a financial settlement. The Lakota people have consistently refused that settlement, maintaining that the Black Hills themselves, not monetary compensation, are what they seek. The land claim remains unresolved. This context is not a digression from the story of Wind Cave. It is part of the foundation of that story. The cave that lies beneath the southern Black Hills exists within a landscape that carries this history. Understanding the cave without acknowledging the landscape, it belongs to would be like trying to understand a river without acknowledging the watershed that feeds it. There is also a more specific and documented historical context worth noting here. The area where Wind Cave is located in the southern Black Hills was part of the broader landscape that the Lakota knew intimately. Various places within and around the Black Hills held specific significance within Lakota tradition and practice. The area that is now Wind Cave National Park was not a remote or unvisited corner of the hills. It was part of a living landscape. As for the cave itself, in the period before formal American exploration, Its presence would have been known, at least in part, through the opening at the surface, which produces the distinctive air movement from which the cave takes its name in the historical record. Whether specific traditions connected to this particular place were held by Lakota communities is a question that requires careful treatment. Scholars and National Park Service researchers have noted that Lakota oral traditions do include references to the Black Hills as a place connected to origins and emergence, and some traditions in the broader plains, indigenous cultural context associate caves and underground spaces with particular spiritual and cosmological significance. However, to make specific claims about what the Lakota believed specifically about Wind Cave, beyond what is documented, would be to invent tradition where the documentary record is incomplete. What can be said honestly is this: the underground world beneath the southern Black Hills existed within a cultural landscape that had been inhabited and known by indigenous peoples for a very long time before the European-American explorers who would name the cave and attempt to map it ever arrived. The cave did not enter human awareness at the moment of its formal discovery. It entered the historical record that outsiders created. This distinction matters not as a political statement, but as a factual one. The landscape has layers. The cave has layers. The human history of the place has layers. And to understand any one of them fully, it is necessary to hold all of them in mind at once. Long before the first lantern was carried into the darkness, and long before the first survey line was drawn through the cave's interior, the hills above were already ancient in their human meaning. There is a quality of the Black Hills landscape that becomes clearer the more time one spends attending to it. The hills are not simply a geological formation surrounded by cultural history. The geological and the cultural are woven together here in ways that are difficult to separate, and that resist the kind of clean categorization that modern analysis often prefers. In many indigenous cultural traditions of the Great Plains, and more broadly across North America, the relationship between the land and its people is not understood in the same way that European philosophical traditions tend to understand it. The land is not, in these traditions, simply a resource or a backdrop for human activity. It is itself a participant in the world, capable of relationships, deserving of respect, and carrying meaning that is not invented by human beings, but discovered by them through long experience and through traditions transmitted across generations. For the Lakota people, the Black Hills have served as what scholars sometimes describe as a landscape of identity, a place so deeply connected to cultural memory and spiritual meaning that the hills are not merely where the Lakota have lived, but in important ways part of what it means to be Lakota. This is not a metaphor in the dismissive sense that outsiders sometimes apply to indigenous connections to land. It reflects a genuine and long-standing relationship documented in historical records, in oral tradition, in treaty negotiations, and in the words of Lakota people themselves across many generations. The hills in this understanding are not simply scenery, they are a text, they carry knowledge, they hold memories. And different places within the hills carry specific associations that are part of a larger geography of meaning that the Lakota maintained through ceremony, through story, through movement across the landscape, and through the practical rhythms of life in this environment over generations. Now consider what it might mean, within such a framework, to know that beneath these hills lies another world entirely. The existence of underground spaces, caves, and passages hidden within the earth is something that many cultures across history and across the world have understood in particular ways. In some traditions, caves are understood as places of emergence where life came from the earth. In others, they are understood as boundaries between different states of being, thresholds that should be approached with care. In still others, they are seen as places where the earth breathes, where the boundary between the underground world and the surface world becomes palpable. Wind Cave has a distinctive quality that makes this last kind of understanding particularly vivid. The cave breathes. This is not a metaphor. The cave system beneath the southern Black Hills is large enough and connected to the surface atmosphere through its entrance that changes in atmospheric pressure cause air to move in and out of the cave with considerable force. When surface air pressure falls, as it does before a storm, air flows out of the cave. When pressure rises, air flows in. The movement is strong enough to be felt standing near the entrance and has been described by early visitors as feeling like a steady wind blowing from within the earth. It is this quality, this breathing, that gave the cave its common English name when American settlers began to encounter and document the region. Wind Cave. A cave from which the wind came. But this quality existed long before the name was applied. The entrance to the cave, a narrow natural opening in the limestone hillside, would have produced this same flow of air for anyone who happened to be near it on a day when atmospheric conditions caused the cave to exhale. What meaning earlier inhabitants of the landscape might have attached to this phenomenon is not something that can be stated with certainty from outside the traditions that would have held that meaning. But it requires no imagination at all to understand that a hillside that breathed, that exhaled cool underground air with the regularity of a living thing, would have been remarkable to anyone who experienced it, in any cultural context, in any period. The relationship between the surface landscape of the Black Hills and the underground landscape of the cave is, in geological terms, very direct. The hills above and the cave below are made of the same rock. The water that falls on the surface makes its way into the underground system. The minerals that formed the extraordinary formations inside the cave came from the same limestone that forms the rock of the hillsides. There is no separation between above and below in any fundamental sense. The cave is not a separate place that happens to be located beneath the hills. It is a part of the hills, a part of their interior structure, as much as any ridge or valley visible on the surface. This geological continuity has an interesting parallel in the way that many indigenous traditions understand landscapes, not as collections of separate features, but as unified wholes in which different elements are related to each other. A stream is not unrelated to the meadow it crosses or the forest through which it flows. A ridge is not unrelated to the valley below it, and a cave, in such an understanding, is not separate from the hills in which it is found. It is part of the same thing, just hidden. The geological world and the cultural landscape arrive at a similar understanding from entirely different directions. This is not coincidence, exactly, and it is not mere analogy. It reflects something real about how landscapes are structured. A watershed is a unified system. A geological formation is a unified structure. The cave is interior to the hills in the same way that the heart of something is interior to its surface. And the traditions that developed over thousands of years of living in and around this landscape may have intuited something that modern science describes in more technical terms, but arrives at by a similar route. It is worth pausing here for a moment to consider the scale of geological time against which this landscape has been developing. The limestone that underlies the surface of the southern Black Hills, the same limestone within which the cave system formed, was deposited in a shallow sea that covered much of what is now the Great Plains during the Carboniferous and Mississippian periods, hundreds of millions of years ago. At that time, there were no hills here. There was no cave. There was only a warm, shallow ocean, and the slow accumulation of the shells and skeletons of marine organisms that over immense spans of time would compress and solidify into limestone. The dome of the Black Hills began to form as deep geological forces pushed ancient rock upward over tens of millions of years. The limestone that had been deposited as part of that ancient seafloor was lifted, tilted, fractured, and eventually exposed at the surface in a ring around the older central core of the hills. And at some point, as rainwater began to work its way into those fractures, the process that would eventually create the cave began. We will explore that process in more detail as we move through this documentary, but for now, consider simply the span of time involved. The limestone is hundreds of millions of years old. The cave has been forming for millions of years. The hills themselves took tens of millions of years to rise to their present form. Human presence in this landscape spans at most a few tens of thousands of years. The history of Lakota connection to the Black Hills in the historical record spans roughly a few centuries. The history of formal American exploration and documentation of Wind Cave spans fewer than 200 years. These different timescales exist simultaneously in the same piece of ground. When you stand on the surface of the Black Hills, you are standing on limestone laid down in an ancient sea. When you enter the cave below, you are entering a space that began to open in geological time and has been continuing to form ever since. When you consider the human history of this place, you are placing a very recent chapter into a story that has been underway for an almost incomprehensible duration. There is something in this layering of time that is, if the word can be used in a precise rather than a vague sense, genuinely profound. Not in the way that the word is often used to mean merely impressive or moving, but in the older sense of the word as something that goes very deep. This landscape goes very deep in every direction. It goes deep into geological time. It goes deep into cultural memory. And it goes deep, literally, beneath the surface, into the hidden passages and chambers that will occupy much of what follows. Above this underground world, the Black Hills continued to hold their history in silence. The pine forests grew and were renewed. The seasons continued. The streams ran clear in spring and quieter in dry summer. And in the hillside, the narrow opening that breathed with the pressure of a hidden world continued its quiet exhalation felt by those who came near it known in ways that no formal document recorded. Part of a landscape that was already ancient when the first written account of the cave was put to paper. The cave had no name in the records before the American settlers arrived, but it had an existence, it had a presence, it had a breath. And the landscape around it had been carrying the weight of human meaning for a very long time. To understand Wind Cave, it is necessary first to understand the rock in which it formed. And to understand that rock, it helps to step back much further than the human history of the Black Hills, further even than the hills themselves, into a time so distant that the very landscape of the continent looked nothing like what we know today. Several 100 million years ago, during the geological period known as the Mississippian, the region that would eventually become the interior of North America lay beneath a warm, shallow inland sea. The climate was tropical by modern standards. The sea was rich with life, corals, crinoids, mollusks, and countless other marine organisms whose bodies were built from calcium carbonate, a mineral compound that, when those organisms died and sank to the seafloor, accumulated in slow and steady layers over millions of years. Layer upon layer of shell and skeletal material compressed under its own weight, combined with dissolved minerals in the seawater and gradually, over enormous spans of time, transformed into stone. That stone is limestone. Limestone is, in this sense, a record of ancient life. Every layer carries within it the compressed evidence of organisms that lived in an ocean that no longer exists, in a world whose geography would be unrecognizable to any modern observer. The limestone that underlies the southern Black Hills is known geologically as the Paha Sapa limestone, a name derived from the Lakota name for the Black Hills, and it represents precisely this kind of ancient marine deposit. It is a rock formed from a vanished sea, carrying the chemistry and the biological memory of that sea within its mineral structure. What makes limestone so important to the story of underground caves is a particular quality of its chemistry. Limestone is composed primarily of calcium carbonate, which is soluble in acidic conditions. Pure rainwater is very slightly acidic on its own, having absorbed a small amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as it falls. But as that water moves through soil, it absorbs additional carbon dioxide produced by the decomposition of organic matter and by the root systems of plants. This increases the water's acidity, transforming it into a mild carbonic acid solution, still far too weak to be felt or tasted, but chemically active enough, given sufficient time, to dissolve limestone. Now imagine that mildly acidic water making its way downward through the soil and into the fractured limestone beneath. The rock is not solid in the way that a concrete floor is solid. It is full of small fractures and joints, cracks that formed as the rock was lifted and tilted by the geological forces that built the dome of the Black Hills. Water follows these fractures downward, seeking the path of least resistance. Where a fracture is wider, more water moves through it and more dissolution occurs. The rock is slowly removed, not all at once, but molecule by molecule, year by year, century by century, in quantities so small as to be invisible to human observation, but enormous when accumulated over geological time. Over thousands of years, a fracture becomes a fissure. Over more thousands of years, a fissure becomes a passage. Over more time still, passages interconnect, widen, branch, and evolve into the complex three-dimensional network that geologists call a cave system. The water that did this work does not disappear. It carries the dissolved calcium carbonate deeper into the earth, and when it eventually reaches air-filled spaces, it can deposit that calcium carbonate again in new forms as the mineral calcite, building the formations that give caves their extraordinary variety of shapes and structures. This is the fundamental geological story of Wind Cave and of most of the world's great cave systems. A rock formed from an ancient sea, lifted by geological forces, fractured by the stresses of that lifting, and then slowly, patiently dissolved from within by water, carrying the chemistry of the surface world downward into the dark. The process is not dramatic in the way that an earthquake or a volcanic eruption is dramatic. It is quiet and incremental, but given enough time, and the geological record provides almost incomprehensible amounts of time, it can produce results of extraordinary scale and complexity. The specific geological history of Wind Cave is somewhat more complicated than this basic description suggests, and researchers are still working to understand all of its details. The cave system appears to have formed over multiple phases, with different processes dominant at different times. Some evidence suggests that the initial dissolution of the limestone may have been driven partly by hydrogen sulfide gas rising from below, a process that produces a particularly corrosive sulfuric acid capable of dissolving limestone from the inside outward rather than from the surface downward. This process, known as hypogenic cave formation, is responsible for some of the world's other notable cave systems, and the evidence at Wind Cave suggests it may have played a role here as well, though researchers continue to study and debate the relative contributions of different processes to the cave's overall structure. What is also important to understand is that the formation of Wind Cave was not a single event with a clear beginning and end. The cave has been forming, changing, and developing over an immense span of geological time. Passages that were once open may have been partially or completely filled with sediment during periods when the hydrology of the region changed. Formations have grown, broken, and been replaced. The cave as it exists today is a complex record of multiple overlapping geological episodes, each leaving its own signature in the rock. There is another geological dimension to Wind Cave's situation that deserves attention. The cave exists within a specific position in the geological structure of the Black Hills Dome. The Paha Sapa limestone in which the cave formed is not a uniform flat layer. It has been tilted, folded, and fractured by the same forces that lifted the Black Hills. The passages of Wind Cave do not simply descend vertically from the surface. They follow the fractures and joints of the limestone, which run in various directions dictated by the geological stresses that created them. The result is a cave system that spreads not only downward, but laterally, extending horizontally through the rock in directions that follow the rock's own internal structure. This gives Wind Cave something of its unusual character among major cave systems. Many large caves are characterized by long linear passages or by dramatic vertical drops. Wind Cave, by contrast, is notable for its extraordinary density of interconnected passages arranged in what geologists sometimes describe as a boxwork of connections, a three-dimensional network of corridors that branch, intersect, cross over and under each other, and connect in patterns of remarkable complexity. It is a structure created by the rock's own geometry, and understanding that geometry requires understanding the geological history that produced it. And at some point, researchers have proposed estimates, but the precise timing remains a subject of study. The water table in the region dropped as the landscape was further eroded and reshaped. Passages that had been filled with water were gradually drained, leaving air-filled space behind. It is in these air-filled spaces that the formations we associate with caves began to grow, and it is through these spaces that human exploration eventually became possible. The process is still ongoing in the geological sense. Water continues to move through the limestone of the Black Hills. Dissolution continues, though at rates far too slow for any human observer to detect within a lifetime. The cave is not a finished thing. It is a geological process that happens to be visible to us at this particular moment in its development, like a photograph taken of a river in mid-flow, capturing one instant of a continuous movement that began long before the photograph and will continue long after. What happened here in these dark limestone corridors, and what can the rock still tell us about how this hidden world came to be? That question, considered across geological time, is one of the things that makes the study of Wind Cave genuinely fascinating to the scientists who work within it. The cave is not just a space to be explored. It is an archive, a record of geological processes written in mineral and stone, decipherable by those who know how to read it. And the reading of that archive is still, in many important ways, in its early chapters. There is a moment when entering a large cave for the first time, when the human mind struggles briefly to make sense of what the senses are reporting. The temperature changes, the ambient light disappears. The sounds of the outside world fall away, replaced by the smaller sounds of stone and water and the movement of air. The space around the body becomes different from any space that ordinary life prepares a person for, enclosed in a way that is total, without the visual horizon that the open world always provides. Wind Cave offers this experience in a particular way, and part of what makes it particular is the nature of its passages and formations. Many well-known cave systems are characterized by large open chambers, by towering stalactites and stalagmites, by underground rivers and dramatic vertical drops. These qualities make for spectacular cave tourism and for compelling photographs. Wind Cave has some of these qualities, but its most scientifically remarkable feature is something more subtle and more geometrically unusual, something that requires a certain adjustment of perception to fully appreciate. The passages of Wind Cave tend to be low and wide rather than tall and narrow. Many of the cave's corridors have ceilings that are only a few feet above the floor, requiring a visitor to walk carefully, sometimes to crouch, navigating through spaces that are more like horizontal slabs of open rock than like the towering corridors of more theatrically dramatic caves. The cave extends horizontally through the limestone in a network of flat, intersecting passages that sometimes create the impression of being within a vast stone honeycomb, or perhaps a library whose shelves have been replaced by rock. This horizontal character reflects the geological structure that created the cave. The passages follow the bedding planes and joint sets of the Paha Sapa limestone, the natural surfaces and fractures within the rock itself. Where two joint sets intersect, passages cross each other. Where a bedding plane was particularly susceptible to dissolution, a horizontal passage opened along it. The result is a cave that spreads through the rock in multiple directions simultaneously, creating a network whose three-dimensional complexity challenges the spatial intuition of even experienced cave explorers. And covering the walls and ceilings of much of this network is the formation for which Wind Cave is most distinctively known in the scientific and geological community. That formation is called boxwork. Boxwork is a speleothem, which is the geological term for any cave formation created by mineral deposition. Most people are familiar with stalactites and stalagmites, which form from water dripping through cave ceilings and depositing calcite as it falls. Boxwork is different in its origin, its appearance, and its scientific significance. Boxwork forms when calcite fills the fractures and joints within limestone, the same fractures and joints that water used to dissolve the surrounding rock. As the rock around those calcite-filled fractures is dissolved away, the harder calcite fins are left standing, projecting from the walls and ceilings of the cave in thin, intersecting blades that divide the cave surfaces into a pattern of connected boxes or cells. The result looks, to the eye, something like a honeycomb, or like a bas-relief map of a city seen from the air, or like the pattern left in a wall when the mortar has held while the bricks have been removed. Wind Cave contains what is recognized as the most extensive and finest display of boxwork known to exist in the world. The quantity, variety, and preservation of boxwork within the cave is genuinely exceptional by any scientific measure, and it has been the subject of considerable geological study. The formations range in scale from small, delicate fins, a few inches across, to larger structures that cover wall surfaces many feet in extent. Their colors vary depending on the mineral content of the original calcite, ranging from honey yellow and cream to reddish and brown tones that reflect iron content in the rock. The scientific importance of boxwork goes beyond its visual interest. Because boxwork forms from calcite that filled fractures in the limestone before the surrounding rock was dissolved, it preserves a record of the fracture network that existed in the rock before the cave opened. Studying the boxwork gives geologists information about the stress history of the limestone, about which fractures were present and how they were oriented, about the timing of different geological events. The boxwork is, in this sense, a record written in mineral of the geological forces that shaped the rock before the cave ever became a space that air could fill. Wind Cave also contains other documented formations, including frostwork, which consists of delicate needle-like crystals of calcite or aragonite that project from cave walls and ceilings in clusters that, despite their name, have nothing to do with ice. The name frostwork refers to their visual resemblance to frost crystals, a comparison that captures something of their delicate, almost feathery character. These formations are among the more fragile structures within the cave, easily damaged by air disturbance or by contact, and their preservation requires careful management of the cave environment. The cave also contains popcorn, which is a textured nodular formation that covers cave surfaces in clusters of rounded calcite or aragonite deposits, created when carbonate-saturated water evaporates from cave walls. Flowstone, which forms when water flows as a thin sheet over cave surfaces and deposits calcite in smooth layers, covers portions of the cave floor in places, creating surfaces that have a quality something like frozen, rippling water. Cave pearls, which are small rounded concretions formed in pools of water, have been documented in parts of the cave. Each of these formations tells a slightly different story about the conditions under which it formed, about the availability and chemistry of water, about the temperature and humidity of the cave at different times. A cave, in this respect, is not a single story, but an anthology, with different formations recording different chapters of the cave's environmental history. There is something in the geometry of Wind Cave that rewards patient attention. The formations are not, in many cases, the kind of formations that dominate a wide-angle photograph. They require close observation. They are intricate rather than monumental, complex rather than simply large. The cave's character is one of extraordinary density rather than extraordinary scale in any single dimension. A labyrinth of intersecting passages, each covered in geological detail, rather than a series of grand open chambers. This character has shaped the experience of everyone who has explored the cave, from the earliest recorded visitors to the scientists and cave explorers who work within it today. The cave demands a certain kind of attention, a willingness to slow down, to look closely, to navigate carefully through spaces that do not offer easy movement. It is a place that rewards patience, and patience in any kind of exploration is its own kind of knowledge. The air within Wind Cave maintains a remarkably consistent temperature throughout the year, hovering close to 53 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of what the surface weather is doing above. This consistency is a characteristic of caves that reach below the zone of seasonal temperature fluctuation, which in this part of South Dakota extends only a modest distance below the surface. Within the cave, the temperature is independent of the seasons, a quality that gives the underground environment a quality of timelessness that is not merely poetic, but genuinely physical. The humidity within the cave is also notably consistent, generally high, though not uniform throughout the system. In areas with more active water movement, the humidity approaches saturation. In passages more distant from active water sources, conditions can be drier, and it is precisely in these drier areas that the more delicate formations, including frostwork and boxwork, tend to be best preserved. The cave breathes, as we noted earlier, and this breathing has its own effect on the interior environment. Air moving through the cave carries with it trace amounts of carbon dioxide and moisture from the surface, subtly influencing the chemistry of the cave air in ways that can affect the behavior of water within the cave and the rate at which formations grow or dissolve. The relationship between the cave's interior and the exterior atmosphere is not simply a physical curiosity. It is an active geological process, one of many that have been shaping this underground world continuously across time. To enter Wind Cave, then, is to enter a geological record of extraordinary richness, written in stone and mineral, across timescales that dwarf human history entirely. The passages around a visitor carry the evidence of an ancient sea, the record of geological forces that built a mountain. The chemistry of millions of years of water moving through rock, and the mineral history of an environment that has been evolving continuously since long before the first human footstep touched the surface of the Black Hills. The cave had been breathing beneath the limestone hills of the southern Black Hills for a very long time before anyone arrived with a lantern and a rope, and the intention of finding out what lay in the darkness beyond the entrance. The documented history of Wind Cave in the American historical record begins in the latter part of the 19th century. The broader region of the Black Hills was not widely known to American settlers until the 1870s, when the military expedition of 1874, which brought news of gold in the hills, drew intense attention to the region. The rush of prospectors and settlers that followed brought an influx of people into a landscape that was already inhabited and already meaningful, and the consequences of that influx shaped the history of the entire region in ways that continued long afterward. In this context, the discovery of Wind Cave's entrance by settlers in the early 1880s was one of many encounters between newcomers and a landscape they were still learning to read. The most commonly cited account of the entrance's discovery involves Tom Bingham, a local man who is reported to have encountered the cave entrance when wind from the cave blew his hat from his head, the same rushing air that gives the cave its English name. His brother Jesse Bingham is also mentioned in connection with early awareness of the cave in this period. These accounts belong to the local historical tradition of the region and have been repeated in many sources connected to the cave's history, though as with many such early stories, the precise details are difficult to verify with documentary certainty. What is better documented is the role of the MacDonald family in the early exploration of Wind Cave. Jesse D. MacDonald and later his son Alvin MacDonald were among the most active early explorers of the cave in the years following its initial discovery by settlers. Alvin MacDonald, who was in his teenage years when he began exploring the cave in the early 1890s, kept a diary of his explorations, a document that is considered one of the most significant primary historical records of the cave's early exploration era. Alvin's diary entries describe his experiences moving through the cave with oil lamps, exploring new passages, naming features that he discovered, and grappling with the growing realization that the cave he was moving through was far more extensive than any initial impression could have suggested. He wrote with the directness of a young person genuinely absorbed in what he was finding, recording distances traveled, formations encountered, and the names he gave to different parts of the cave. Some of the names he assigned to passages and chambers remain in use today, embedded in the map of the cave as reminders of one person's early attempt to impose the order of language on an underground landscape that resisted easy comprehension. The MacDonald family operated a small tourist enterprise in connection with the cave during this period, guiding visitors into the cave by lamplight, in an era when cave tourism was becoming a recognized form of attraction in several parts of the United States. The cave's unusual formations, and particularly its boxwork, were noted by early visitors as something distinctively different from what they had seen in other caves. Even without the scientific vocabulary to explain precisely what made the boxwork geologically significant, early visitors could see that the cave walls were covered in something they had not encountered elsewhere, something intricate and strange and particular to this place. The physical challenges of early exploration deserve some consideration. The cave was entered by the natural opening in the hillside, which was considerably more difficult to navigate than the improved entrances that would later be constructed for tourist access. Passages within the cave were, and remain, low in many places, requiring a person to move with care. The lighting available to early explorers, oil lamps and candles, was sufficient to illuminate a small area immediately around the explorer, but created deep shadows everywhere else, limiting the sense of the space being navigated and making it easy to become disoriented in a system where passages branched repeatedly and where the same view could look similar from multiple angles. The risk of becoming lost in the cave was real and was understood by the explorers of this period. In a cave system where passages branch constantly and where there are few natural landmarks that a person can memorize reliably in the partial darkness of lamplight, the challenge of knowing where you are and how to return to the entrance is far from trivial. Early explorers used various methods to maintain their sense of direction, paying careful attention to distinctive formations, marking passages in ways that were recoverable, carrying significant reserves of lamp fuel. The possibility of a lamp going out in a deep section of the cave, leaving an explorer in the absolute darkness of an underground system, was something that would have been understood without any dramatization. The cave attracted attention from beyond the local community as early exploration continued. A number of visitors passed through the Black Hills in the years following initial settlement, and the cave was mentioned in several accounts of the region. The United States Geological Survey sent personnel to examine the cave as part of its broader work in the region, contributing early scientific observations to the understanding of the cave's geology. By the late 1890s and into the early 1900s, the question of what should be done with the cave, who should manage it, how it should be accessed, and how it should be protected, had begun to attract the attention of people concerned with the broader question of the preservation of significant natural features. The late 19th century in the United States was a period when the idea of setting aside lands for public preservation was gaining momentum. Yellowstone had been established as a national park in 1872, the first such designation in American history. The movement to recognize and protect significant natural landscapes was slowly building, and the extraordinary underground formations of Wind Cave attracted the interest of those who saw in the cave something worth preserving. There is a human quality to the early exploration of Wind Cave that is worth dwelling on for a moment. Alvin MacDonald, exploring the cave in his teenage years in the early 1890s, was engaging in an act of discovery in the most direct sense, moving into a space that no one had mapped, that no one had named, that had no record in any document. He was young and he was curious, and he carried a lamp into the darkness and wrote down what he found. The diary he kept is not a document of great literary sophistication. It is the record of a young person paying attention, naming things, trying to make sense of a space that defied easy comprehension. That act of paying attention, repeated by explorer after explorer across the years and decades that followed, is the foundation on which the scientific understanding of Wind Cave has been built. The cave did not reveal itself all at once. It revealed itself slowly, passage by passage, survey by survey, generation after generation of people who were willing to enter the darkness with whatever tools they had, and to document what they found there. And as each new section of cave was explored and documented, the larger picture that emerged became more complex, more extensive, and more remarkable than the picture that had existed before. A map is an act of translation. It takes something that exists in three-dimensional space, a landscape, a coastline, a network of streets, or in this case, a system of underground passages, and represents it in two dimensions in a form that can be read, understood, and used by people who may never have been to the place being described. A good map allows a reader to navigate a space they have never entered. It allows knowledge of a place to exist independently of the experience of being there. It is one of the most powerful and most ancient tools that human beings have developed for understanding and sharing their knowledge of the world. Cave mapping is a particularly demanding form of this activity. Underground passages do not have the features that make surface mapping relatively straightforward. There is no horizon. There is no sunlight by which to determine direction. There is no reference to landmarks outside the cave itself. The passages do not run in straight lines or follow simple curves. They branch, they converge, they change level, they cross over, and under each other in three dimensions that no flat surface can fully represent without significant simplification. To map a cave passage, a survey team typically works with a compass, an inclinometer for measuring the angle of a passage as it rises or falls, and a measuring device for recording distances. The team moves through the cave in sections, recording the direction and angle of each segment of passage and measuring its length, then taking notes on the width and height of the passage at each point. These measurements are later combined into a drawing, traditionally done by hand and now often rendered with the assistance of computer software that attempts to represent the three-dimensional reality of the cave in a form that can be communicated and preserved. The challenge of doing this accurately in the confined, low-ceilinged passages of Wind Cave, by lamplight in the early years and by headlamp in more recent decades, with the constant physical demands of navigating a space that requires crouching, crawling, and careful movement, is considerable. A survey session in a cave like Wind Cave might cover a few hundred feet of newly documented passage. The survey notes from that session would later be combined with the notes from dozens, hundreds, and eventually thousands of other sessions to build a composite map of the cave system. The history of cave mapping in Wind Cave extends back to the early years of exploration, when explorers like Alvin MacDonald began making rough sketches of the passages they were finding. These early attempts were limited by the tools available and by the incomplete knowledge of the cave's extent that any single explorer could acquire in the pre-survey era. But they represented the first attempts to translate the underground world into a form that could be communicated and preserved. As the 20th century progressed and systematic cave exploration became more organized, the mapping of Wind Cave became more rigorous and more comprehensive. The National Park Service, which administers Wind Cave National Park, has maintained an active survey program. And the cave has attracted the attention of explorers and researchers affiliated with the National Speleological Society, which is the primary organization in the United States dedicated to the exploration, study, and preservation of caves. The accumulation of survey data over many decades has produced a cave map of considerable detail and considerable length. The documented surveyed length of Wind Cave runs to more than 150 miles of mapped passages, placing it among the longest known cave systems in the world. This figure represents the total length of all the passages that have been explored and surveyed by teams working systematically through the cave over many decades. It is a number that requires a moment to absorb. more than 150 miles of passages within a limestone formation beneath the hills of South Dakota. Passages that branch and intersect and connect in patterns of extraordinary complexity, passages that go unlit except when an explorer carries a lamp into them. Passages that have been forming for millions of years and that carry in their walls and ceilings the mineral record of that formation. And yet the surveyed length, impressive as it is, does not represent everything. Cave mapping is an ongoing process. The survey of Wind Cave has not reached an end point because the cave has not finished revealing its extent. Survey teams continue to explore leads, passages, or connections that have been noted but not yet fully explored, and to document new sections of the cave. The complexity of the cave's passage network is such that even after many decades of systematic survey, new discoveries continue to be made. This is not because the cave is mysterious in any supernatural sense. It is because the cave is genuinely, measurably vast, and because exploring and documenting a cave system of this complexity is a long-term undertaking that proceeds methodically, survey session by survey session, lead by lead. A cave map, when completed for any section of the system, has a particular kind of beauty that is its own reward. The lines that represent passages run in multiple directions, cross each other, split, reconnect, and spread across the page in patterns that reflect the actual structure of the rock. Looking at a map of Wind Cave's surveyed passages is something like looking at a map of a city seen from a very great height, except that the streets of this city are passages in stone, and they exist in 3 dimensions that the 2-dimensional map can only partially represent. Some survey maps use different colors or line weights to indicate different vertical levels within the cave system, creating a visual impression of a 3-dimensional structure laid flat. There is also something that a map reveals about what it does not show. A cave map can tell you where explorers have traveled. It can show you the passages that have been documented, the connections that have been traced, the chambers that have been visited and measured. What it cannot do by itself is tell you what lies beyond the passages that have been explored. A passage on the map that ends without connection to another passage may end because the cave ends there, because the rock is too solid to have dissolved further, or because the passage has been filled with sediment. Or it may end because the explorer who reached that point chose to turn back, because the passage became too small to navigate, or because the survey session ran out of time or lamp fuel. These unresolved endings on the map, survey leads, in the language of cave exploration, are in some ways the most interesting parts of a cave map. They are the places where the known ends and the unknown begins. They are the points where the documented world gives way to the undocumented one, where the map gives way to darkness. In Wind Cave, there are many such leads. The cave's complexity is such that the process of resolving them, exploring each lead to its conclusion, determining whether it connects to another passage or reaches a genuine terminus, is an ongoing project that has occupied cave explorers for many years and will continue to occupy them. Each resolved lead either extends the map or confirms a boundary. Each new connection found between previously separate sections of the cave adds to the understanding of how the cave system is structured. There is a question that arises naturally from the history of cave mapping in Wind Cave, and it is a question that has occupied both cave explorers and geologists who study the cave's hydrology. Given the documented length of the cave system and the density of its passage network, and given what is known about the structure of the limestone formation in which it formed, how large might the full cave system be? How much of the rock beneath the southern Black Hills has been hollowed by the slow work of dissolving water, This question does not have a definitive answer. Geological modeling and geophysical surveys can provide some constraints on the possible extent of the cave system, but they cannot map what explorers have not yet entered. The honest answer is that the full extent of the cave system beneath the Black Hills is not known. What is known is that the surveyed portion is already of remarkable size and complexity, and that exploration continues. And as each new section is documented and added to the map, the invisible world becomes, very slowly, a little more visible. Part 3 begins now. Continuing directly from where Part 2 ended, this section covers chapters 8 through 11, the labyrinth in full immersive detail, the underground ecosystem, the history of conservation and Wind Cave National Park, and the genuine scientific mysteries that remain. The ghostly labyrinth beneath the Black Hills and the Wind Cave Mystery Part 3, chapters 8 through 11. Chapter 8. The labyrinth beneath the Black Hills. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes only from moving through a space rather than reading about it. Maps are essential, geological descriptions are necessary, survey numbers communicate real meaning. But the experience of moving through Wind Cave, of being inside its passages, enclosed by its stone, guided by the small circle of light that a headlamp casts against a ceiling of ancient rock, is something that resists complete translation into language. It is, in the most direct sense, immersive, and because this documentary cannot bring you inside the cave itself, what it can offer instead is an attempt to describe, as honestly and as carefully as possible, what that underground world is actually like. Begin at the entrance. The natural opening in the limestone hillside is not large. It is a narrow gap in the rock, the kind of opening that would not attract much notice if you walked past it on a dry and sunny afternoon when the cave was exhaling only gently. The stone around the entrance carries the weathered grey surface of limestone exposed to the elements for a long period, roughened by rain and frost and the slow working of lichen and moss. Above the entrance, the hillside continues upward in the gentle slope characteristic of the southern Black Hills, covered with grasses and scattered ponderosa pines, ordinary in every visible respect, carrying no outward sign of the extraordinary space that lies beneath it. Step past the entrance, and the temperature changes immediately. The outdoor air, whatever its season, whatever its character on the particular day, is replaced by the consistent cool air of the cave, that steady 53 degrees that does not vary with the months or the decades. Air that has been underground long enough to lose its seasonal identity. The humidity rises. The sounds of the outside world recede, replaced by the small sounds that caves make, the distant drip of water somewhere in the rock, the almost imperceptible movement of air through passages that you cannot see. The first passages of the cave near the main entrance are the passages that most visitors encounter on guided tour. They are not the cave's most dramatic spaces in terms of sheer size, but they are representative of the cave's character: low ceilings, well-worn passage floors where generations of footsteps have created a path, walls covered in the geological details that the cave offers in such abundance. The boxwork here is visible in good lighting, its honeycomb pattern covering surfaces that were once the walls and ceilings of the dissolved limestone. The calcite fins projecting with the fragile delicacy of something that has been forming for a very long time in conditions far more stable than the outside world offers. But the cave that most people experience on a guided tour is only a small portion of the total cave system. The passages open to regular tourism represent a carefully selected portion of the cave, chosen for accessibility, for the quality of formations they contain, for the practical requirements of guiding groups of people safely through underground space. They offer a genuine experience of the cave, but they offer it in the way that a carefully curated sample offers an experience of a much larger whole. Beyond the tourist passages, the cave continues, and continues, and continues. To follow a cave explorer working in the unmapped or partially mapped sections of Wind Cave is to understand the cave at a different scale. The explorer carries a survey kit, compass, clinometer, measuring tape, notebook, a reliable light source with backup, and moves through passages that have not been prepared for easy navigation. The floors may be uneven, covered in cave sediment that is slippery in places, broken by small formations that must be stepped around carefully to avoid damage. The ceilings in many passages require crouching. In some sections, the only way forward is to crawl on hands and knees through a passage whose ceiling has descended to within a foot or two of the floor. This physical reality of cave exploration is worth dwelling on, not for dramatic effect, but for honest understanding. The labyrinth of Wind Cave is not an abstract concept. It is a physical space that must be navigated by a human body with all of a human body's limitations and requirements. A passage on a survey map that appears as a simple line represents a physical route that a person traveled in the dark with the weight of survey equipment, managing the practical challenges of movement through confined underground space. The survey numbers that define the cave's documented extent represent thousands of hours of exactly this kind of work, accumulated over many decades. The three-dimensional structure of the cave is difficult to hold in the mind all at once, and this difficulty is not a failure of imagination, but a genuine feature of the cave's complexity. Passages in Wind Cave do not arrange themselves on a single level. They exist at multiple depths within the limestone, connected by vertical shafts and sloping corridors that link one level to another. Moving through the cave is not simply a matter of navigating a horizontal network. It involves moving up and down as well as laterally, finding the connections between one level and another, understanding how the three-dimensional structure of the rock has shaped the three-dimensional structure of the cave. In some sections, passages that run on different levels are separated by only a few feet of solid rock. A cave explorer moving through a low crawlway might be within arm's reach of another passage above or below, without being able to see it, access it, or know for certain that it is there. The cave's density, the extraordinary closeness with which its passages are packed together within the limestone formation, means that the relationship between known and unknown within the cave is not simply a matter of the cave having distant, unexplored regions. It is also a matter of passages that are separated by very small distances of solid rock from already mapped sections, passages that will not reveal themselves until an explorer finds a way through or around the intervening rock. There is a particular experience that experienced cave explorers describe, a quality of the cave space that is easy to overlook from the outside, but becomes viscerally apparent from within. It is the experience of being surrounded on all sides by stone, of knowing that the rock above, below, and to either side of you extends without interruption in every direction for a considerable distance, and that the only open space anywhere nearby is the passage you are standing in. This experience is not frightening in the way that the word underground sometimes implies for people who have never explored caves. Experienced cavers describe it more as a quality of presence, of the stone making itself felt as something solid and real and immense in a way that the open sky does not. The stone is there in the way that the sky is not quite there. It is tangible, bounded, defined, pressing gently against the consciousness in a way that is different from anything the surface world offers. Wind Cave's passage network in its surveyed extent presents a complexity that is, in all honesty, difficult for any single mind to hold as a complete picture. The cave's map, when printed in full, is a document of considerable size, covered in lines that represent more than 150 miles of documented passages arranged in multiple levels, connecting and reconnecting in patterns that reflect the geological structure of the rock. Looking at that map is like looking at a diagram of a very large and very intricate piece of machinery, one that was designed not by an engineer, but by geology itself. By the specific fracture patterns and bedding planes of a particular body of limestone in a particular part of the Black Hills. And the map, large as it is, represents only what has been documented so far. The labyrinth metaphor, the title with which this chapter opened, is worth examining with some care, because it can mislead if taken too literally. A labyrinth, in the classical sense, is a constructed thing, designed by a builder with the intention of creating confusion and making navigation difficult. Wind Cave is not a labyrinth in that sense. It was not designed, it was not built, it was not created with any intention whatsoever. It is a natural geological structure produced by processes that had nothing to do with complexity as an objective. And yet the effect, for a person moving through it, is something that the word labyrinthine genuinely captures. The branching passages, the repeated intersections, the multiple levels, the passages that look from the inside, like other passages you have already been through. The constant need to maintain awareness of your position and your route back to the entrance. These qualities create exactly the experience that the word labyrinth is meant to describe. The cave is a maze not because it was designed to be one, but because the geology that produced it is of sufficient complexity that the human mind, navigating through it with limited light and limited information, experiences it as one. This is one of the places where the geological and the experiential diverge most interestingly. The geologist looks at the cave and sees a record of fracture patterns, dissolution rates, and mineral deposition. The explorer moving through the cave experiences it as a space of extraordinary complexity, where knowing where you are requires constant attention and where the darkness at the edge of your light always conceals more than it reveals. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The cave is both a geological record and a human experience, and it is impossible to fully separate them. The labyrinth beneath the Black Hills continues in every direction from the passages that explorers have followed. It extends into stone that no human being has yet entered. It holds formations that no human eye has yet seen. It contains within its geometry a record of geological history that is still being read slowly and patiently by the people who carry lights into the darkness and write down what they find. How do explorers find their way through a world they cannot fully see? And what does it mean to draw a map of something that is still in the process of being discovered? These questions do not have simple answers. They are, in a certain sense, the same question that all exploration asks, whether the space being explored is an underground cave system or a coastline or an ocean or the surface of another world. The answer is always the same, slowly, carefully, methodically, with attention to detail, and with the humility to acknowledge that what has been documented is always only part of what is there. Chapter 9: Life, Water, and Silence Below. Underground caves are often thought of, by people who have never explored one, as empty spaces. The word cave suggests a hollow, a void, an absence of the things that characterize the living world above. A cave, in this common imagination, is dark and cold and still, a space defined by what it lacks rather than by what it contains. Wind Cave is not an empty space. The cave is in geological terms, an active environment. Water moves through it, though not always in ways that are immediately visible to a visitor standing in one of its passages. The same water that continues the slow process of dissolving the limestone and depositing minerals in new formations is also the foundation of a biological ecosystem that exists within the cave in ways that are not obvious, but that are real and scientifically important. Let us begin with the water itself. The water that enters Wind Cave comes from the surface of the Black Hills, making its way downward through the soil and the fractured limestone above the cave by the same processes that have been shaping the cave system for millions of years. This water is not simply a geological force. It is also a carrier, transporting organic material from the surface, dissolved carbon compounds, microorganisms, nutrients, downward into the cave environment. In this sense, the cave is not sealed off from the biological world of the surface. It is connected to it by the movement of water that serves as a bridge between the two. Within the cave, this waterborne organic material provides the foundation for a microbial community that exists in conditions of remarkable austerity. Caves are, by definition, environments without sunlight. Most life on Earth's surface ultimately depends on photosynthesis, the process by which plants and other photosynthetic organisms convert sunlight and carbon dioxide into organic compounds that serve as the foundation of food chains. In a cave, there is no sunlight. This means that the energy basis for life must come from somewhere other than solar energy. In Wind Cave and in cave systems generally, the primary energy sources for cave life are chemosynthesis, the use of chemical reactions to produce energy, and the organic material brought in from the surface by water and by the occasional entry of surface organisms. Microbial communities living on cave walls and in cave waters use chemical energy from mineral reactions, including reactions involving iron, sulfur, and manganese compounds present in the rock and water, to sustain their metabolism. These microbial communities are thin and sparse by the standards of the surface world, but they are real, they are active, and they play a role in the ongoing chemical and mineral processes of the cave environment. Research into cave microbiology is a relatively young field, and the scientific understanding of cave microbial communities continues to develop. What has become clear from research conducted in Wind Cave and in cave systems around the world is that the microbial life of caves is not simply a minor curiosity, but a genuinely significant component of the cave ecosystem. Microbial activity can influence the rate at which minerals are deposited and dissolved within the cave, contributing to the formation of some of the unusual mineral structures found in cave environments. Some researchers have proposed that microbial processes may have played a role in the formation of certain types of cave formations, though the extent and significance of this role is a subject of ongoing scientific investigation. Wind Cave is also home to a variety of larger organisms that have adapted to the cave environment to varying degrees. Some species are permanent cave residents, having evolved over geological time to live in conditions of complete darkness and constant temperature. These cave-adapted organisms, known as troglobites, typically display the evolutionary adaptations that darkness and isolation tend to produce over long periods, reduced or absent eyes, which are metabolically expensive to maintain in an environment where they serve no function, reduced body pigmentation, and often extended sensory organs that compensate for the absence of vision. In North American caves, these adaptations are well documented in groups including certain cave beetles, cave crickets, cave spiders, and cave amphipods, among others. The documented biological surveys of Wind Cave have identified a range of invertebrate species adapted to the cave environment, though the full inventory of cave-dwelling life within the system is not yet complete. This is not surprising, given the complexity and extent of the cave system. A thorough biological survey of a cave system of this size and intricacy is a substantial scientific undertaking, and the understanding of Wind Cave's biological community continues to develop as researchers conduct new studies. Beyond the permanently cave-adapted species, Wind Cave is also home to organisms that use the cave seasonally or opportunistically. Bats are among the most significant of these. Several species of bat are known to use portions of Wind Cave, taking advantage of the stable temperature and protected environment for roosting and, in some cases, for winter hibernation. Bats that hibernate in caves are particularly vulnerable to disturbance during their hibernation period, when any interruption of their torpor forces them to expend energy reserves that cannot be replenished during winter. The management of cave environments with significant bat populations requires careful consideration of this vulnerability. The relationship between bats and caves is not simply one of convenience. Bats that use caves for roosting and hibernation contribute to the cave ecosystem by bringing energy from the surface, in the form of the insects they consume outside, into the cave environment. Bat guano, deposited in cave areas used for roosting, is a significant energy source for cave communities, supporting populations of invertebrates and microorganisms that might not otherwise have sufficient nutrients. In this way, the bat serves as a biological connection between the productive surface world and the energy-limited cave environment. The silence of the cave is real, but it is not absolute. Water dripping from a ceiling creates a small, clear sound that carries in the enclosed space of a passage. Air moving through narrow connections between passages can produce a faint sound that is somewhere between a whisper and the idea of wind. In passages near active water, the sound of flowing water may be audible even before the water itself comes into view. These sounds are small relative to the sounds of the surface world, but in the compressed quiet of the cave, they carry a particular quality of presence. The temperature of Wind Cave, consistently around 53 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, is itself a significant feature of the cave's ecology. This temperature is warm enough that liquid water can exist throughout the year, and cool enough that the metabolic rates of cave organisms are reduced relative to what they would be in a warmer environment. For hibernating bats, the stable cool temperature is precisely what makes the cave suitable for overwintering. For microbial communities, the temperature consistency means that the environmental conditions for their activity remain relatively constant, without the dramatic seasonal fluctuations that surface organisms must accommodate. The humidity of the cave varies by location within the system, but tends to be high, particularly in areas near active water sources. High humidity is important for the preservation of the delicate mineral formations that cover the cave walls, since it prevents the evaporation that would otherwise dry out the thin films of water responsible for mineral deposition. Areas of the cave with lower humidity, whether naturally or as a result of increased air circulation from human access, show different formation characteristics and often better preserved examples of formations like boxwork and frostwork that require stable conditions to develop without damage. This brings us to a dimension of the cave's character that deserves explicit acknowledgement. The underground world of Wind Cave exists in a state of environmental balance that is genuinely fragile. The conditions that allowed the extraordinary formations within the cave to develop over millions of years, the stable temperature, the consistent humidity, the particular chemistry of the water and air are conditions that can be disrupted. And disruption, once it occurs in a cave environment, can cause damage that takes geological time to reverse, if it reverses at all. A formation that required thousands of years to grow can be broken in a moment. A cave wall covered in frostwork crystals can be stripped of those crystals by a single careless touch. The oils from human skin, deposited on a formation by contact, can interfere with the mineral deposition processes that allow formations to grow, effectively halting the formation's development. Contaminants introduced into the cave environment, whether through human contact or through changes to the water chemistry of the system, can alter the conditions under which cave organisms live and the processes by which cave minerals are deposited. The cave is not fragile in the way that a soap bubble is fragile, in the sense of being liable to disappear entirely from a small disturbance. It is fragile in the way that a very old and very intricate record is fragile, not easily destroyed outright, but easily damaged in ways that remove information and detail that cannot be recovered. The boxwork formation that took tens of thousands of years to develop its present form cannot be restored once it is broken. The microbial community that lives in a particular section of cave wall cannot be recreated once it is altered beyond a certain point. The cave environment carries within it a record that is both scientifically valuable and irreplaceable, and that record is more easily damaged than it appears. The silence of the cave, then, is not simply a sensory experience. It is an ecological condition. The quietness of the underground world is part of what allows its particular community of life to exist, and part of what has allowed its extraordinary formations to develop over the spans of time that were required to produce them. When humans enter that quietness, they bring with them the potential for disturbance, and managing that disturbance is one of the central challenges of preserving the cave as both a scientific resource and a natural environment. Chapter 10: The Cave and the Modern World. Wind Cave became part of the United States National Park System in 1903, when President Theodore Roosevelt signed legislation establishing it as Wind Cave National Park. It was the 7th national park established in the United States, and the first cave in the world to be designated as a national park, a distinction that reflects both the scientific significance of the cave and the broader movement of that era toward recognizing natural features as worthy of formal protection. The establishment of Wind Cave National Park occurred in a specific historical moment. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period when the idea of public land preservation was gaining both political support and popular understanding in the United States. The national park system, still young and still being defined in its purpose and scope, was expanding to include natural features beyond the dramatic landscapes of Yellowstone and Yosemite. The recognition of Wind Cave as worthy of national park status reflected a growing understanding that natural significance could be geological as well as scenic, that an underground world of scientific interest was as deserving of protection as a mountain range or a geyser field. The establishment of the park did not immediately resolve all questions about how the cave should be managed, how much access should be provided to visitors, and how the balance between public use and scientific preservation should be struck. These questions would continue to evolve across the decades that followed, as the understanding of the cave deepened, and as the practices of both cave tourism and cave conservation became more sophisticated. In the early decades of the park, cave tours were conducted with candles and lanterns. Visitors carried their own lights into the cave, and the physical infrastructure of the cave tour routes was minimal. As the 20th century progressed, and as the national park system developed more systematic approaches to visitor management, the tour infrastructure in Wind Cave was gradually improved. Trails were established within the cave, lighting was installed in the tour sections, and entrances were improved to make access safer and more comfortable for a wide range of visitors. The range of tour offered at Wind Cave today reflects an effort to provide different levels of access and engagement with the cave, from the well-lit, easily navigable tour through the main visitor sections to the more physically demanding tour that take participants into less developed sections of the cave, requiring crawling through low passages and navigating without the benefit of permanent lighting. These more challenging tours are designed to give visitors a more direct experience of what cave exploration actually involves, a sense of the physical reality of the underground environment that is different from what a standard tourist route can convey. The scientific study of Wind Cave has developed in parallel with its management as a public attraction. Geological research into the cave's formation, mineralogy, and hydrology has produced a substantial body of scientific literature over the decades. Biological surveys have documented the cave's fauna. Hydrological studies have examined the relationship between surface water, groundwater, and the cave system, contributing to the understanding of how water moves through the Black Hills limestone. Climate studies have examined the relationship between the cave's internal atmosphere and surface conditions, including the investigation of how changes to the surface environment might affect conditions within the cave. The National Park Service maintains a research program connected to Wind Cave National Park that includes both ongoing scientific investigation of the cave itself and broader ecological research in the park's surface environment, which encompasses a significant area of the southern Black Hills, including grasslands that are home to bison, pronghorn elk, and a variety of other species. The park manages one of the largest free-roaming bison herds in the national park system, a herd whose history of conservation is itself a significant part of the park's story. The surface environment of the park above the cave is not simply a backdrop for the underground attraction. It is an ecosystem in its own right, one that is connected to the cave below in ways that the science of the cave's hydrology and biology has gradually made clear. The water that falls on the grasslands and forests above the cave eventually makes its way into the cave system. The plant and organic material from the surface enters the cave through water pathways. The condition of the surface landscape has direct implications for the condition of the underground landscape. This connection between surface and underground was not always well understood or well represented in the management of the park. Like most cave management programs, Wind Cave's approach to preservation has evolved considerably over time as scientific understanding has developed. The early decades of the park's operation were characterized by practices that later generations of cave managers would recognize as damaging to the cave environment. Introduction of foreign materials, alteration of natural airflow patterns, use of artificial lighting that encouraged the growth of algae and other photosynthetic organisms in lit sections of the cave. Many of these early practices have been reversed or modified, and the current management approach reflects a much more sophisticated understanding of cave ecology. The question of how much human access a cave can sustain without significant damage to its scientific and natural values is one that does not have a simple answer. Every visitor to Wind Cave changes the cave's environment in small ways, contributing body heat and moisture, potentially introducing microorganisms from the surface, wearing away cave sediment along established paths. In aggregate, across thousands of visitors per year over many decades, these small effects become significant. The management of visitor numbers, the maintenance of established paths, the careful design of lighting and ventilation for the tour sections, and the restriction of access to scientifically sensitive areas are all part of an ongoing effort to balance public access with long-term preservation. There are sections of Wind Cave that are off-limits to all but scientific researchers, areas where the formations are particularly fragile or the scientific significance particularly high. There are also sections that are deliberately left as reference areas, cave environments that are maintained in as undisturbed a state as possible in order to provide a baseline against which the effects of human access in other sections can be measured. These reference areas are part of the scientific infrastructure of the cave, places where the cave's natural condition is preserved not only for its intrinsic value, but as a tool for understanding what the cave would be like without human influence. The conservation of Wind Cave is, in this sense, not simply a matter of protecting formations and preventing damage. It is a scientific project, an ongoing effort to understand a complex natural system well enough to manage it responsibly, and to preserve within it the conditions that allow both its natural processes and its scientific potential to continue into the future. The cave that President Roosevelt designated as a national park in 1903 was understood then primarily as a geological curiosity of unusual formations and great visual interest. The cave that is understood today is all of that, but it is also recognized as an ecosystem, a hydrological system, a biological community, a geological archive, and a cultural landscape, a place of many overlapping kinds of significance that require different kinds of attention and different forms of care. And beneath the managed surface of the park, beneath the visitor center and the tour routes and the research records, the cave continues in its own time, forming and dissolving and depositing in the dark, at a pace that has nothing to do with any human schedule. Chapter 11, What We Still Don't Know. There is a temptation, in any documentary about a natural wonder, to end the exploration of known facts by gesturing dramatically toward hidden mysteries, to suggest that the cave conceals secrets that science has not yet unlocked, that the underground world holds revelations just around the next dark corner. This documentary will not do that, not because there are no genuine uncertainties in the scientific understanding of Wind Cave, but because the real uncertainties are more interesting than invented ones, and because they deserve to be stated honestly rather than dramatized. The scientific understanding of Wind Cave is, in many important respects, genuinely incomplete. This is not a failure of science, and it is not evidence of anything extraordinary or supernatural. It is the natural state of knowledge about a system of sufficient complexity that understanding it requires long-term, sustained scientific investigation across multiple disciplines. Let us begin with what is known and work outward toward the edges of current understanding. The cave's basic geology is well established. Researchers understand that the cave formed in the Paha Sapa limestone, that the dissolution of the limestone by acidic groundwater is the primary mechanism of passage formation, and that the boxwork and other formations within the cave were produced by mineral deposition processes that are well understood in general terms. The National Park Service and the scientific community have a solid baseline understanding of the cave's physical structure in the sections that have been explored and mapped. What is less well understood is the precise history of the cave's formation over geological time. Cave formation is a process that extends over millions of years, and that involves multiple overlapping episodes of dissolution, deposition, and environmental change. The history of the water table in the Black Hills region, the history of the regional hydrology, the timing of different phases of cave development. These are questions that geologists have made progress on, but that are not yet fully resolved. The cave's formation history is a subject of ongoing research, and different researchers have proposed somewhat different models for how the cave's complex passage network developed over time. There is also the question of the cave's full extent. As noted in the chapter on mapping, the documented length of Wind Cave exceeds 150 miles of surveyed passage, and exploration continues. The full extent of the cave system beneath the Black Hills is not known. Geological modeling can provide estimates of how much limestone has been dissolved in the region, and geophysical survey methods can provide some information about the structure of the rock, but they cannot tell us definitively how many more miles of passage remain to be explored. The honest answer to the question of how large the cave system might be is, we do not know. The surveyed portion is already of remarkable size, and the geological characteristics of the limestone and the documented density of the cave's passage network suggest that what has been explored is not necessarily all that exists. There are specific types of scientific questions about Wind Cave that remain active areas of research. The hydrology of the cave, how water moves through the system, where it enters, where it exits, how it interacts with the broader groundwater system of the Black Hills, is a subject of ongoing study. Understanding the hydrology of a cave system has practical importance beyond its scientific interest. The Black Hills limestone is an aquifer, a body of rock that holds and transmits groundwater, and the water that moves through Wind Cave is connected to the water that people in the region use. Protecting the water quality of the cave environment is therefore connected to protecting the broader groundwater resources of the region. The biological understanding of the cave is also still developing. The full inventory of cave-adapted species in Wind Cave has not been completed. The microbial communities of the cave are a subject of active scientific interest, with researchers examining both the diversity of cave microbial life and the role that microbial processes play in the cave's mineral formation and dissolution. The extent to which microbial activity has influenced the formation of specific features within the cave, including some of the unusual secondary mineral deposits, is a question that different researchers have addressed differently, and that remains open to further investigation. The relationship between the cave and the surface environment above it is another area where understanding continues to develop. Climate change has the potential to alter the hydrological conditions that govern the cave's formation and ecology. Changes in precipitation patterns, in soil moisture, in the vegetation cover of the surface landscape above the cave. All of these surface changes have the potential to affect conditions within the cave in ways that are not yet fully understood. Research into this question has particular practical importance as the regional climate continues to change in measurable ways. There is also a category of uncertainty that is perhaps less amenable to scientific investigation, but that deserves acknowledgement. The cave has been forming for a very long time, across multiple episodes of geological change, climate change, and biological change. The record of those changes is written, partially, in the mineral deposits of the cave itself. But reading that record fully requires methods and interpretive frameworks that are still being developed. The cave's geological history is richer and more complex than current understanding can fully account for, and portions of that history are represented in the cave's formations, in ways that researchers have not yet learned to read. None of this constitutes a genuine scientific mystery in the sense of something that challenges the foundations of geological understanding. The processes that formed Wind Cave are well understood in their general outlines. The formations within the cave are chemically and physically interpretable. The biology of cave systems, while complex, is not beyond the reach of scientific investigation. What these uncertainties represent is not the edge of scientific capability, but the natural frontier of investigation in a system whose complexity requires more time and more study to understand fully. The mystery of Wind Cave, honestly stated, is the mystery of scale and complexity. It is the mystery of a natural system that has been forming for longer than human memory can reach, that extends through more space than any single human lifetime of exploration can map. And that contains within its stone a record of geological history that is still in the process of being read. That mystery is real, and it is genuinely interesting, and it does not require any embellishment or exaggeration to communicate. Science does not remove wonder from a landscape. It changes the character of that wonder, making it more specific and more grounded in evidence, but it does not diminish it. The more that is learned about Wind Cave, its geological history, its biological community, its hydrological connections to the surface world, the more clearly it becomes apparent that the cave is a system of extraordinary richness and complexity that repays sustained attention without ever becoming fully transparent. The cave continues beyond the edge of what is known, and beyond the edge of what is known, it continues still. There is a moment in the late afternoon in the Black Hills when the light changes in a way that is particular to this landscape. The sun, descending toward the western horizon beyond the edge of the hills, begins to cast long shadows across the ridgelines and through the ponderosa pines. The shadows are not the short, flat shadows of midday. They are deep and directional, pulling across the hillsides in a way that emphasizes the texture of the terrain, the gentle undulation of the forested slopes, the slight irregularities in the ridge profiles, the places where rock outcrops break through the pine canopy and catch the last warm light. The color of everything shifts in this hour, the greens of the pine forest deepening toward something richer, the pale limestone of the exposed rock faces warming to honey and ochre, the grasses in the valley floors going from green to gold. In this light, the Black Hills look ancient. Not ancient in a vague or poetic sense, but ancient in the way that landscape geologists mean the word, carrying in their visible form the evidence of processes that have been at work for an almost incomprehensible span of time. The dome shape of the hills themselves, the way they rise from the surrounding plains with that distinctive rounded profile, is the product of tens of millions of years of geological uplift and erosion. The limestone ridges that ring the inner hills reflect the pattern of the original marine sediments, tilted and exposed by the same forces that built the dome. The valleys that cut through the limestone have been shaped by water moving across the surface for a very long time, following routes determined by the rock's own structure and composition. To stand on a ridge in the Black Hills at this hour and look out across the landscape is to look at time made visible. Not human time, not the scale of centuries and generations that human history moves within, but geological time, the time of mountains and oceans, and the slow drift of continents. The landscape holds this time silently, the way a book holds a language that is legible only to those who know how to read it. And beneath the ridge on which you are standing, the cave continues. The cave does not care about the light. It does not know the difference between afternoon and midnight, between summer and winter, between a busy day with hundreds of tourists moving through its lit sections and a quiet night when the gates are closed and no human presence disturbs the darkness. The cave exists in its own time, which is geological time, and it responds to conditions measured not in hours or seasons, but in centuries and millennia. The formations on its walls grow by fractions of millimeters per year. The passages expand or contract by processes so slow that no human lifespan could observe the change directly. The water that moves through the limestone above the cave takes years, in some cases, to travel from where it falls as rain to where it finally enters the cave system. This difference in timescale between the human world of seasons and lifetimes and the geological world of cave formation and erosion is one of the more quietly profound aspects of the Black Hills landscape. The hills above are, in human terms, ancient, carrying in their form the evidence of processes that predate any human presence on the continent. The cave below is, in geological terms, a relatively recent development. It began forming perhaps a few million years ago, which is recent by the standards of the limestone in which it formed. And human engagement with the cave, in the form of exploration and tourism and scientific study, is recent even by human historical standards, extending back only about 150 years in the documentary record. These three timescales, geological, prehistoric, human, and historical, are all present simultaneously in the same landscape. They do not replace each other, they accumulate. The hills that carry the memory of an ancient sea in their limestone also carry the memory of human presence across thousands of years, and also carry the history of the more recent period of exploration and conservation. Each layer of time is written in a different medium: geological time in the rock itself, prehistoric human time in the archaeological record, and in the cultural traditions of the peoples who have known this landscape, historical time in documents and maps, and the built infrastructure of the park. The Lakota relationship with the Black Hills, including the complex and painful history of the treaty period and its aftermath, is also part of this accumulated memory of the landscape. The Black Hills do not belong to geology alone or to the history of cave exploration alone. They belong to a human history that is older and richer and more complicated than any single chapter of that history can contain. The land that is now Wind Cave National Park sits within a territory whose political and legal status has been contested for more than a century and a half. And that contestation is part of the landscape's contemporary meaning in ways that no honest account of the Black Hills can ignore. This is not a simple thing to hold in mind alongside the geological wonder of the cave and the scientific interest of its formations. It requires a certain kind of attention to recognize that the same landscape can be simultaneously a geological record of extraordinary richness, a cultural landscape of deep significance to the people who have the longest relationship with it, and a site of historical events whose consequences have not been resolved. These layers of meaning are not in conflict with each other. They are simply all true at once, present together in the same hills, the same forests, the same limestone, the same underground passages. The National Park Service manages Wind Cave National Park within this context, working to fulfill obligations of preservation and public access, while also engaging with the ongoing questions about the land's significance to the Lakota people and to other indigenous communities with connections to the region. Tribal consultation is now a formal part of the park management process, reflecting both legal obligations and a growing recognition that the management of public lands is enriched by the perspectives of the people who have the longest relationship with those lands. The cave, for its part, continues beneath all of this human complexity in its own indifferent way. It does not participate in the human conversations about ownership and sovereignty and conservation and tourism that unfold above it. It does not care about the boundary of the national park or the route of the tour trail or the position of the survey stakes that mark the extent of what has been mapped. It simply continues in the dark at the pace of geological time, forming and dissolving and depositing, adding fractions of millimeters to formations that are already thousands of years old, maintaining the constant temperature and humidity that have been its character for long before any human being walked the surface of the hills above. And in this indifference, if indifference is the right word for the quality of a geological process that has no awareness of anything at all, there is something that functions, for a human observer, as a kind of perspective. The cave has been here longer than any human institution. It will be here, in some form, long after any institution currently managing it has changed beyond recognition. The hills above it have been here longer still, and will endure longer than any current feature of the human world. This is not a melancholy observation. It is a grounding one. The landscape of the Black Hills surface and underground together offers a kind of perspective that is genuinely valuable, a reminder that the time within which human history unfolds is nested within a much longer time, and that the ground beneath our feet has its own history that we are always only partially reading. The late afternoon light fades on the hillsides, the long shadows merge into the early dusk. The ponderosa pines stand still in the cooling air. Below the surface of the hill, in the complete darkness of the cave, the formations on the walls continue their almost imperceptible growth, and the air continues its slow movement through passages that have been open for longer than human memory can reach. Imagine a cave without visitors. Not the cave as it is on a slow day in November, with only a handful of guided groups moving through the lit sections. Not the cave as it is on a night when the park is closed and the gates are locked. Imagine it without any human presence at all, as it existed for the vast majority of its geological history and as it exists in its deepest and most remote sections even now. In this cave, there are no lights. The darkness is not the darkness of a room at night, where eyes gradually adjust and the faint ambient light from windows or cracks eventually becomes enough to make out shapes. This is the darkness of deep underground, where no photon has ever arrived, where there is nothing for the eyes to adjust to, where the concept of seeing simply does not apply. Hold your hand in front of your face, you would not know it was there. In this cave, the silence is very nearly complete. The sounds that fill ordinary experience, traffic, wind, birds, the distant noise of other people's lives, the constant low hum of the world conducting its business, are entirely absent. What remains is the sound of the cave itself. Water somewhere in the passage system, moving over or through or dripping onto stone. Air, the slow exhalation and inhalation of the cave breathing through its entrance in response to changes in atmospheric pressure, moving through passages as a very gentle current. The occasional small sound of a mineral formation adjusting to some infinitesimal change in temperature or chemistry, a sound so small and so infrequent that it would register as nothing in the presence of any other sound. But that in the total silence of the cave has a quality of presence that is difficult to describe. This is the cave as it always is, in the passages beyond the reach of the tour lights. This is the cave that the survey teams enter and then leave behind when they return to the surface. The cave that resumes its silence the moment the last footstep fades and the last light disappears around the corner of a passage. The cave does not change when the explorers leave. It continues exactly as it always has, forming and depositing and breathing without any reference to the human world that surrounds it above. There is something in this constancy that resists easy description. The word stillness comes close, but is not quite right, because the cave is not still. It is active, in the slow geological sense, continuously in the process of becoming something slightly different from what it was. The word emptiness is also not right, because the cave is full of rock and mineral and air and water, and the living communities that have adapted to its particular conditions. Perhaps the closest approximation is the word patience, though this is a word that implies a mind, and the cave has no mind. What it has is time. An enormous, unhurried, indifferent amount of time, during which the processes that have been at work since, long before the first human being set foot in any part of North America, have continued and will continue without interruption. The formations on the walls of the quiet passages are adding to themselves, fractions of millimeters per year, as they have been doing since the water table dropped far enough below them to allow air into the spaces where they grow. The boxwork that covers the ceilings and walls has been in place for far longer than its current visitors have existed as a species. The passages that branch and reconnect and lead to further passages that lead to further passages have been open to the movement of air and the slow seepage of water for longer than most of the surface features of the Black Hills, which are themselves products of geological time. There is a philosophical dimension to this, though it is perhaps more honestly described as a perceptual one. Human beings spend the vast majority of their lives within a timescale defined by human concerns, seasons, years, lifetimes, generations. Even historical consciousness, which extends backward through centuries and in some cultural traditions through many more centuries than that, is still a very short window relative to geological time. The cave offers a different window, a glimpse into a timescale that is so much larger than any human frame of reference that it requires a certain deliberate effort of imagination to approach. In that timescale, the entire history of human presence in the Black Hills is a very brief episode. The history of Lakota connection to the Black Hills, which extends back considerably further than the written historical record, and which the archaeological record suggests has deeper roots still, is, in geological terms, very recent. The history of formal exploration and scientific study of Wind Cave is, in geological terms, essentially instantaneous. The cave existed for millions of years before the first human being stood at its entrance and felt the wind coming from below. It will exist for a very long time after the last human visitor has departed. This does not make the human history of the cave less significant. History is always short relative to geology, and this does not diminish its meaning. The Lakota history of the Black Hills is not less real or less important because it is brief in geological terms. The work of Alvin MacDonald and the cave surveyors and the scientists who have studied the cave is not less valuable because it represents a tiny fraction of the cave's existence. Human history has its own significance on its own terms within its own timescale. But there is a quality of proportion that the cave offers when considered in its full geological context that is useful. The cave reminds us, not through any message or intention, since it has neither, but simply through its age and its indifference, that the landscapes within which human history unfolds are not simply backdrops for that history. They are themselves actors in a much longer story, one that was underway before human beings existed, and that will continue after the specific concerns of any particular era have passed away. The quiet labyrinth beneath the Black Hills holds this longer story in its walls. Every passage is a chapter, every formation is a sentence, every layer of mineral deposition is a word in a language that takes geological time to read. And the reading of it, by the scientists and explorers who carry lights into the darkness, is ongoing, patient, and always incomplete, not because the cave is withholding anything, but because a story told in geological time takes geological time to hear. In the quiet of the cave, the formations grow. In the passages that no human has yet entered, the darkness is complete and unchanged. In the sections that have been mapped and documented, the survey notes and the maps carry the record of human attention, the careful translation of underground reality into a form that can be studied and understood and preserved. And the cave continues through all of this in its own unhurried way. The Black Hills at night are a particular kind of beautiful. The sky above them is very dark because the hills are remote enough from large cities that the ambient light of human settlement does not significantly diminish the stars. On a clear night, the full depth of the sky is visible above the pine forest in a way that is increasingly rare in many parts of the United States. The stars appear not as scattered points, but as a continuous field of light, the near stars bright and distinct, the more distant ones merging into the soft glow of the galaxy that stretches in a faint band from one horizon to the other. The Milky Way is visible above the Black Hills in a way that suggests some of what the night sky looked like before artificial light became the defining characteristic of human environments. The ponderosa pines are silhouettes in this light, their shapes barely distinguishable from the darkness of the sky, a slightly deeper darkness against the starfield. The air has cooled considerably from the afternoon warmth. There is very little wind in the valleys, but on the exposed ridgelines, the air moves steadily, carrying the smell of pine and the cold mineral scent that high country air carries at night. The streams are invisible in the darkness, but can still be heard, the small continuous sound of water over stone that carries further at night when other sounds have diminished. The surface of the hills is quiet. The larger animals have moved into their nocturnal patterns. Coyotes may be heard occasionally, their sound carrying across the valleys with a clarity that the daytime hours rarely allow. Owls move through the pine forest on silent wings. Bats, perhaps some of the same bat species that use the cave below for roosting, move through the night air above the meadows, following the insects that are their food, their navigation by echolocation as precise and as invisible as the geological processes unfolding far beneath them. And beneath all of this, beneath the pine forest and the limestone outcrops and the cold grass of the valley floors and the streams that carry the water of the hills toward the surrounding plains, the cave continues in its absolute darkness. The tourist paths are empty. The electric lights that illuminate the formations for daytime visitors are dark. The gates at the entrances are closed. No human voice carries through the passages. No footstep sounds on the stone path. The cave is as close to its natural state as it ever becomes in the period since human beings began to regularly enter it, which is itself the briefest possible flash of time against the cave's geological age. In this stillness, the cave is not waiting for anything. It is not sleeping in any sense that the word implies. It is simply continuing as it always has, as it always will. The water that seeps through the limestone above, taking months or years to complete its journey through the rock and into the air-filled passages below, continues its slow descent. The calcite that is being slowly deposited on the edges of a boxwork fin, molecule by molecule, at a rate too slow to measure without the most sensitive instruments, continues its deposition. The air that moves through the passages in response to the pressure difference between the cave interior and the outside atmosphere continues to move, a breath so gentle and so continuous that it has been going on for the entire geological lifetime of the cave. It is possible, at the end of a long exploration of a place like the Black Hills and the cave beneath them, to find oneself holding two simultaneous feelings that are not in contradiction with each other, but that take some effort to hold together. The first is a feeling of deep familiarity with the specific landscape that has been explored, its geological character, its human history, its underground formations, its scientific significance, its cultural meaning. The second is a feeling of equally deep humility in the face of how much of that landscape remains beyond complete understanding. These two feelings belong together. The more specifically a landscape is understood, the more its geological history is traced, its formations documented, its biology surveyed, its cultural significance acknowledged, the more apparent it becomes that understanding is always partial, always in progress, always encountering new complexity at the edge of what has already been learned. A landscape that is superficially understood seems, paradoxically, simpler than one that has been studied deeply. Deep study reveals depth, and that depth does not bottom out. Wind Cave is a landscape in this sense, a place where the more that is known, the clearer it becomes how much remains to be understood. The surveyed passages represent an extraordinary achievement of sustained exploration, but they also reveal, by their very extent, the possibility that more remains beyond them. The geological study of the cave's formations has produced a rich body of knowledge, but it has also generated new questions about the cave's formation history that previous generations of researchers did not have the tools or the data to ask. The biological understanding of the cave's ecosystems has identified communities of organisms whose full character and significance are still being worked out. This is the honest state of knowledge about Wind Cave. It is not a state of ignorance. It is a state of active, ongoing, productive inquiry into a system whose complexity continues to reward attention. The Black Hills carry this complexity on their surface and below it. The stone that forms the hills was once the floor of an ancient sea. The limestone in which the cave formed was once the accumulated remains of marine organisms living in warm tropical water. The dome of the hills was raised by geological forces that had nothing to do with any human intention or awareness. The cave that formed within the limestone is the product of water and chemistry and time in quantities that exceed any human scale of reckoning. And within this geological context, the human history of the Black Hills, the long indigenous presence, the Lakota relationship with the land, the period of conflict and treaty-making, the era of settlement and exploration, the establishment of the national park, the scientific study of the cave, is a chapter in a story that extends far beyond it in every direction. That chapter matters. The human history of the Black Hills is real and important and deserves to be understood with care and honesty. But it is enriched, not diminished, by being understood within the context of the longer geological and ecological story within which it is embedded. The hills hold all of this at once. Their surface carries the record of geological time in the form of eroded rock and shaped valleys and outcrops of ancient stone. Their forests carry the record of ecological time in the composition of the trees and the animals that move among them. Their cultural landscape carries the record of human time in the traditions of the people who have known this place longest, and in the documented history of the people who have studied and managed it more recently. And their underground world carries its own particular record, written in mineral and formation and the geometry of dissolved rock, in the darkness below the surface, where the quiet processes of the earth continue without reference to any of the human concerns that unfold above. Tonight, above the Black Hills, the The stars continue their slow arc across the sky. The pines are still. The streams run quietly in the darkness. A coyote calls somewhere in a distant valley, the sound rising and falling and fading into the cold air. Beneath the surface, the cave breathes gently. Air moves through passages that have been open for longer than the hills above have been hills. Water seeps through limestone that was once the floor of an ocean. Calcite settles in fractions too small to see onto formations that will continue to grow long after every human institution currently connected to this place has changed into something else entirely. The labyrinth beneath the Black Hills is not a mystery that waits to be solved. It is a landscape that waits to be understood slowly and carefully, and without the expectation that understanding will ever be complete. It is a hidden world that has been forming in the dark for a very long time. And that will continue forming in the dark for a very long time after the last survey team has returned to the surface and the last light has been switched off and the cave has returned once again to the quiet it has always kept. The hills stand dark against the stars, the forest is still, and deep beneath the stone, in the silence that has always been there and will always be there, the cave continues.